Hello everyone, welcome to your lecture for Chapter 12 in Motor Development. Chapter 12 is focusing on the social and cultural constraints within motor development. And if we kind of start to approach this chapter in terms of the different perspectives, whether you are a researcher that has a maturationist perspective or maybe more of an ecological perspective, the idea that social and cultural aspects can influence motor development may be a bit of a surprise to a maturationist. If you believe that genetics determines development, you'd be really kind of hard pressed to think of society as a developmental agent or some sort of developmental constraint. However, if you're a researcher that follows kind of the ecological perspective, these individuals believe that not only social and cultural influences can greatly influence as well as interact with an individual and their specific task constraints. So this means that media coverage of events like women's wrestling and ice hockey may actually encourage participation in these sports by changing some of the social and cultural stereotypes associated with female sports. So your first part of the chapter talks about socio-cultural constraints. Societal and cultural beliefs, attitudes, as well as stereotypes can either encourage or discourage certain motor behaviors, and these are ever-present environmental constraints. If you're thinking back to chapter 1, we kind of introduced this idea of socio-cultural influences as environmental constraints. The idea that socio-cultural attitudes of groups of people either can encourage or discourage certain motor behaviors. Now, these factors are considered environmental constraints because they reflect a general attitude or maybe a belief system that's present either in society at large or maybe in smaller certain subcultures. And if these attitudes are pervasive enough, they can modify someone's behavior. They might not be obvious, yet they can still exert a powerful influence on how individuals move. And think about things like temperature, the light in a room, a specific sports field or community, that supports, the Friday Night Football League. Very similar. So can attitudes, values, norms, and stereotypes really kind of envelop us and also kind of define us. And even back in the late 1970s, girls were still not necessarily encouraged to participate in sports. A lot of times they weren't expected at all to be physically active. This type of attitude about women or girls in sports meant that the opportunity to play organized sports or even pick up sports was very limited. However, the passage of Title IX back in 1972 drastically changed the landscape of sport in the United States, and it made it more possible and at times more socially acceptable for girls and women to participate in sport. Participating in physical activities contributes to motor development. The benefits of experience in physical activity are well known, they are well documented and include improvised physical and emotional health. In addition, sport can influence the behavioral patterns of participants, such as teaching leadership and how to be a good teammate, how to be a good follower. It's very important on a team that we have individuals that can fulfill the roles of a team leader as well as a team follower. You have to have both on a team in order for your team to be successful. Other skills such as listening to a coach, dealing with maybe a coach that you don't particularly care for, are all different types of things that you learn in an environment, especially being involved in sports. So it makes sense to provide opportunities for all people to participate in sport and physical activity from an early age throughout the lifespan. However, decisions to participate in sport or at least maintain a physically active lifestyle can have as much to do with the social constraints as well as individual constraints. For example, individual constraints of most typically developing American children allow them to participate in a wide variety of activities. Yet, what do the children want to do when they get home from school? They want to play on the computer. They want to get on those video games. They want to play Fortnite, or they want to watch television. Why is this the case? And a lot of it has to do with an individual's early socialization in sport and physical activity. Think about if someone's had a very positive experience. You feel good about participating. Maybe you liked your coach, your team won, you got a lot of praise about your particular skill. Those types of feelings encourage individuals to participate in sports. If you think about the inverse occurrence that could happen, you didn't do well, your coach was mean to you, they yelled at you all the time, maybe you were late to practice a lot, you just didn't enjoy what you were doing, that influences your behavior probably to not want to participate again. So people and situations continue to influence individuals in their choice of activities throughout their lives. And this is kind of referred to as the socialization process. It talks about the process by which one learns a social role in groups with certain values, morals, and rules. And it's related to sport and physical activity, including individuals who are influential in the process. And it kind of deserves our attention as a major environmental constraint in one's motor development. So you can see here on this particular slide that there are three major elements of the socialization process that lead an individual to learn a societal role, whether it be someone that's very physically active in sports or whether it's someone that takes kind of a back seat to that. So the first major element in the socialization process are important people who are considered socializing agents. They're sometimes also referred to as significant others. But this could be anyone that plays a major role in determining if someone is physically active. Again, it could be a coach, it could be a parent, it could be a teacher, it could be a friend, it could be a peer of an adolescent. Another major element are the social situations. So this is kind of the place where socialization occurs. And think about your first experiences in physical activity. Normally it happened at school, maybe on the playground, maybe on a sports field because you were physically active, even at the home. And the other final major element to the socialization process then are the personal attributes of the individual, or also the individual constraints. And when looking at the first two of the elements, to really see their influence and importance in the process of socialization, we understand that among these socializations agents are also family members, peers, teachers, coaches. It really kind of helps give some insight on how these particular individuals and situations and elements can either encourage or discourage certain motor behaviors. And if you've ever heard of the long-term athlete development model, the LTAD, it talks about physical literacy and how if we learn at an early age to move and to run, jump, hop, skip, and to play outside and to either play in pickup games or in organized sports, there's a lot of skills that we'll be able to carry into our adult life that would be very difficult to do if we aren't learn them very early on. And so we can see with this kind of population that's so willing to participate in video games, online gaming, watching TV, playing on their computers, physical literacy is something that's at risk for the next generation of individuals, which then means their future health and the development of possible chronic diseases are on the rise as well. So first we're going to examine sort of a cultural phenomenon called gender typing in sport and physical activities. When discussing gender typing, I want you to go back and think of one of the first socializing agents in regards to significant others, families, peers, coaches, and teachers. These significant others enter any sort of context with prescribed notions of how they, as well as others, should act. And I should clarify, they enter a context with socially and culturally prescribed notions of how they, as well as others, should act. One examination of such notion is that of gender-specific stereotyping, and this shows just how potent socio-cultural constraints can be. In general, people are born physiologically either male or female, which means that their biological characteristics determine their sex, and that goes back to the X and Y chromosomes. In contrast, gender refers to the culturally determined sociological construct that differentiates between the masculine male and the feminine female. Parents and other significant socializing agents often will encourage children towards what they perceive as gender-appropriate behaviors, and sometimes it's even based on each child's biological characteristics. In research by Royce, Gibelt, Duff, and then followed up by Shakib and Dunbar, found that in terms of developing motor skills, significant others steer boys toward masculine activities and girls toward more feminine sport and physical activities. This practice is termed gender stereotyping. And children really begin to learn these particular gender roles very early, perhaps even as young as their first year of life. So you can see some examples here of what society, or at least in the United States, considers masculine sports, like football, wrestling. There's a lot of notice that's taken when we see a female on the football team, or when we see that there's a female wrestler competing on the mat with another boy. And then some feminine sports that we might think would be less appropriate for males, things like gymnastics, figure skating, when in turn a lot of these sports can be very beneficial for both the opposite gender. Traditionally, Western societies gender type participation in sport and physical activities. So that's kind of what we listed here on the previous slide. In addition, Westerners consider sport to be important and appropriate for boys. However, that attitude doesn't always carry through for girls. Therefore, adults often permit and encourage kind of this rough and tough play for young little boys, whereas they might be more likely to discourage a little girl from wrestling, rolling around, throwing rocks, throwing a baseball, things like that nature. So we're going to go ahead and move past this question. But before we go on, I do want to address kind of this question. Why is the issue of gender typing important for girls and boys? Why are we discussing this? What it means is for girls, limited involvement and limited practice may not allow them to develop their motor skills to their full potential. Even girls who do participate may feel that all-out effort and skilled performance are gender inappropriate. And this in turn could affect a female's motivation for participating, for training, for striving for high achievement standards that kind of rival those of males. At the same time, boys may feel forced to participate in gender-appropriate sports that they dislike. Worse, they may drop out of physical activity altogether rather than be subjected to participating in an undesired but gender-appropriate sport. So this pervasive societal influence on boys versus girls sport participation could very well factor into measurements of skill and fitness that compare the sexes. And this is an important consideration in the context of an integrated model of interacting constraints. What appears to be a fitness or maybe skill difference in boys and girls based on a physiological makeup, their sex, may in fact be related to a lifetime of stereotyped influences. And that was something that came out of the research done by Campbell and Eaton. And so that kind of goes back to that idea of physical literacy that we brought up a minute ago, is that if we don't practice and participate in these skills at a very young age, it could have a lifelong impact on their health and well-being. Okay, so moving forward now, talking about significant others. We've already kind of discussed that these are influential people who are considered socializing agents. We've discussed the fact that they can be anyone important in that particular individual's life, such as a parent, a sibling, a peer, a teacher, or maybe even a coach. So now your book kind of breaks down these socializing agents to kind of discuss maybe the different impacts that each of these significant others may have on an individual. So in regards to parents, they are particularly important during early childhood because they're the ones that are there. They're the ones that are raising these individuals, whether it be their biological parents, adopted parents, foster parents, maybe a grandparent that's taken over custody of the particular child. So when someone participates in physical activities during after early childhood, those individuals probably reflect the interests of the parents during those early years. And parents can encourage children to engage in either physical or sedentary activities, and it could relate to the participation habits of the parent, interestingly enough. So if the children see that their parents get home from work and sit on the couch and eat their dinner on the couch, that becomes that child's norm. It's a normal behavior. It's a habit that their parents follow. And so that's what the children sees as appropriate behavior. However, if they see the parent maybe get off of work and go home and switch into some workout gear and maybe go for a jog or maybe do some push-ups and sit-ups in the living room, again, what the child see becomes kind of their norm and an appropriate habit in an individual's life. As children become physically active, parents can encourage or discourage games and eventually specific sports or specific activities. And according to Weiss and Barber from a study in 1996, parents' early involvement could lead to a lifetime of participation in physical activities for a child. About 75% of eventual sports participants have already been involved in sports by age 8. So that's pretty young. In fact, the best predictor of adult sports performance or involvement is participation during childhood and adolescence. So it follows then that a parent's early bias toward or even away from physical activity can have lasting consequences. And even though Title IX may be opening new doors for girls in terms of parental expectations for gendered activity, things might not have changed so much for boys. Kane and his team of researchers did a study in 2007, and it was determined that parents perceived gender nonconformity in their preschool children as primarily positive, but only within a limited range for their sons. At the same time, the same parents in the study reported that it was important for their sons to conform to normative standards of masculinity. Very, very interesting. Individual parents may also play different roles in socializing children into physical activity. Snyder and Spreitzer in 1973, quite a while ago, proposed that a child's same-sex parent is the most influential in the extent of that child's sport involvement. And listen, I want you to listen to that statistic again. The child's same-sex parent, so a son's father or the male, figurehead in their life, or the daughter's mother, is the most influential in the extent of that child's sport involvement. Furthermore, McPherson suggested specifically that mothers serve as a sport role model for their daughters. So we kind of touched on that a second ago. This was also supported by DiLorenzo in 1998. This particular researcher found that for 8th and 9th grade girls, their mother's physical activity and support were predictors for physical activity. So the mother, the female lead, the female significant other in that child's life has a major influence on the health and well-being regarding physical activity participation for their children. Greendorfer and Luco in 1978 identified fathers rather than mothers as a major influence in the sport involvement of both boys and girls. And then later in 1980, Luco and Ewing found that fathers influenced boys between the ages of 9 and 11 years old who were very involved in sport. and that mothers influenced highly involved girls. So there's lots of research out there that supports that the significant other, the parent to the children are the ones that are highly influential in the development because of their own personal beliefs that they carry with them and then pass on to their children. So another significant other that your book goes into depth about are siblings. And it makes sense that after we are greatly influenced by our parent or that mother or father figure in our lives, then our next kind of peers that we are around almost all the time are our siblings. Siblings really are a child's first play group, and they can influence girls and boys' sport participation. In fact, Weiss and Knoppers in 1992 said both brothers and sisters can influence girls' sport participation. Studies suggest that African American boys see athletes as their role models and that their male siblings shape their idea of who a role model really is. It is possible that for most children, siblings merely reinforce the socialization pattern into physical activity that's been established by the parents rather than acting as a major socializing force themselves. So it really is kind of the parent figure first, and then the siblings obviously are being brought up by the same parents, and they kind of reflect and emphasize that same environment that the parents have instilled. However, as a child begins to age into adolescence and then eventually young adulthood, this sibling influence tends to diminish. A child's peers have the potential to reinforce or counteract the sports socialization process that's begun in the family. So these are individuals that are outside of the family unit, but they are particularly important after childhood. So as our siblings kind of fade out influence, then our friends, our social group kind of fades in and takes on a significant role. And they really do provide a strong influence for group activities such as team sports and maybe non-sport clubs. Peer group preference for passive activities can lead to once active children into sedentary adolescence. So if an individual, an adolescent, was very physically active, and then they got to middle school and they befriended a group of individuals that were really into maybe coding or computer clubs, and they like to meet all the time before and after school in the library. Those peers can have an influence, and eventually an adolescent might decide that they'd rather like to be with their friends than doing the activities that they did before. They did a study with boys and girls from several countries, including the United States, Japan, and Canada, and reported that peers influenced their childhood sports participation. During pre-adolescence, children enter a more formalized peer group, otherwise known as cliques, and these peers continue to be influential throughout adolescence. In fact, Greendorfer in 1976 found that the peer group was the only socializing agent that influenced sport involvement through all phases of the life cycle studied: childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood. Other socializing agents were important at some ages, but not at others. For example, the family. So important to young children, which is probably less influential for adults. It's likely that the typical middle-aged adult, even one who was involved in sport as a youth adult, reduces their sport involvement. A study done by Ibrahim and Rowland found that 704 women between the ages of 44 to 93, only 25% of them took part in vigorous activity during the week before the study. And they postulated that this trend might be due in part to a lack of programs aimed specifically at middle-aged and older adults. However, it has been changing in recent years as emphasis on fitness that began in the late 70s has led to a greater availability of exercise and recreation programs for members in these age group. And typically, once involved, adults keep participating in order to be part of a peer group. And despite the strong influence of peer groups on sport participation throughout life, it's still not clear that membership And a sport-oriented peer group always precedes participation. And what that means is that a person is drawn to an activity because of a desire to associate with peers. And it is possible that individuals first select groups that fit their interests, including an interest in the sport, although it's unclear which comes first. The interest in the sport and the desire to be part of the peer group make it likely that an individual will continue to participate and to select membership in active groups. Peers apparently play just as important role in sports socialization as the family plays. Coaches and teachers as another influential group can also influence an individual's participation. Male athletes consistently report that coaches and teachers influence both their participation in and their selection of sports, particularly when they were adolescents and young adults. Female athletes report that teachers and coaches influence them during childhood and adolescence as well. But in contrast, Yamaguchi found in 1984 that school teachers and coaches were not influential. So whenever we have research out there, we're always going to see research that kind of opposes each other, and that's all right. So we have to look at the research as a whole. The bottom line is that participants rarely name teachers and coaches as the most influential agents in their sport involvement. Maybe then the role of teachers and coaches is to strengthen their sport socialization process that was begun earlier by their family and friends. What this means then is that teachers and coaches should be very careful to not overlook their potential influence, though, regarding their students' sport involvement. They're able to introduce children to exciting new activities, to stimulate them to learn the skills and attitudes associated with the sport. Conversely, teachers and coaches need to recognize the potential that they have to turn their students away from sport and physical activity. Bad experiences, especially in school, can have a lifelong consequences for a person's overall lifestyle. And this is known as aversive socialization, when maybe a teacher or a coach embarrasses a child in front of their peers. Maybe they overemphasize performance criteria at the expense of learning and enjoyment, or maybe they plan class activities that result in some sort of overwhelming failure rather than success. Children who experience aversive socialization naturally will then avoid physical activities and then fail to learn skills. And consequently, any attempts that they make to participate end up frustrating them and discouraging them. And that has major implications, again, for a lifelong participation in sports, mostly physical activity, which then, again, we have that risk of developing the chronic diseases that come with inactivity. So the key point is it's essential that coaches and teachers understand their potential influence in either promoting or deterring physical activity participation among their athletes and students. Moving on then to discussing social situations that can act as developmental constraints. We talk about the situations, the events that children spend their time in during their formative years are part of this socialization process. And so we really get into how the play environment, how the games that children play can act as constraints, as well as the toys that children use can influence later physical activity patterns and habits. So we first start talking about the actual environment and the games that children play. An adequate environment for play, such as a sports field, a backyard, a playground, can provide the social situation and the environment that a child needs in order to begin involvement in sport and physical activity. Play spaces probably also influence activity selection. A child who lacks an adequate play space has a diminished capacity to get involved in activities and practice skills. These environmental constraints then discourage participation in sport and these gross motor activities. So this is why we see a lot of times that children who grow up in urban areas that have limited play space are typically exposed to sports and activities that require very little space and equipment, such as basketball. And then also we think about children that live in colder climates right now. Good gracious, the poor rest of the country right now is freezing. But these colder climates provide children with a different opportunity than us Floridians down here to learn things like ice skating, whereas warmer climates like our Florida environment encourages maybe surfing or swimming or skateboarding and things like that, because we have an opportunity to be outside for a longer period of time during the year due to our closeness to the equator. Play environment can also act as a sociocultural constraint, especially if the play space has gender-associated values, which can then influence boys and girls to participate, again, in gender-typed activities. For example, double Dutch rope jumping kind of falls into the feminine or female physical activity domain, whereas a boy could be labeled a sissy for rope jumping and thus be discouraged from participating in that particular activity. A girl might be told that a certain sport, maybe football or wrestling, is inappropriate, and the female could be labeled as a tomboy if she does participate. Western society has kind of traditionally considered certain types of games appropriate for boys, but not for girls, and vice versa. And this labeling is particularly apparent as children enter adolescence. And the pressure to participate in gender-appropriate games has implications for children's opportunities to practice skills. Traditional boys' games are typically complex. They involve the use of strategy. Participants are encouraged to work hard in pursuit of specific goals and use negotiation to settle disputes over rules. And traditional girls' games, on the other hand, are typically non-competitive. And rather than encouraging interdependence among group members, they involve waiting for turns to perform simple repetitive tasks like jumping rope or playing hopscotch. Such games rarely give girls the opportunities to increase game complexity or to develop increasingly more difficult skills. In fact, the game often ends because the participants lose interest, not necessarily because they achieve a goal. These days, more and more children are participating in activities that are not considered gender appropriate. Further, some sports and activities like soccer and aerobics are losing their gender-specific associations. Gender typing of sports and activities still exists. However, it acts as a strong constraint on movement activities. And educators should keep in mind that a play environment that channels boys and girls into gender-typed games perpetuates a situation in which boys can better develop complex motor skills, but girls cannot. Playing with toys, another possible social constraint to the development of physical literacy. Imagine walking into a toy store as a child. What do you think? What do you feel? Bright colors, loud sounds, encourage you to come toward toys that really kind of promise to enlighten and engage and excite you. And as a child, maybe even as an adult, you might not realize that these toys act as a part of the socialization process. Yep, even toys are constraints. Toys can encourage children to be active or inactive. For example, think about a frisbee, or if you remember those koosh balls that you kind of squish in your hand. Those type of toys encourage a child to throw, to catch, maybe to be more accurate in their throws, and they have to judge, an individual has to judge where they need to position their body in order to be able to make that catch. On the other hand, a board game or maybe a doll encourages sedentary play. Toys can also stimulate children to emulate sports figures. We can find basketball, soccer, and cheerleader Barbies, as well as the WWE action figures. And at the same time, video and computer games can simulate sport without promoting any physical activity at all. So each kind of toy has its advantages, but certain toys facilitate children's socialization into a sport and physical activity more than others do. Toys are also a means by which gender typing can occur in the socialization process. For example, toys marketed to boys tend to be more complex and encourage more vigorous activity than those marketed to girls. The typical girl's toy such as a doll or maybe a kitchen set, promotes quiet indoor play. Gender typing through toys is well entrenched in society, and even children under 2 years old may be aware of the gender association of toys. Blake Moran Centers did a series of studies that was finally published in 2005. They interviewed undergraduates to determine their perceptions of gender suitability of certain toys, as well as to find out how they related to the characteristics of the toys. The participants associated girls' toys with physical attractiveness, nurturance, and domestic skill, and associated boys' toys with violence, competition, excitement, and to some degree danger. Manufacturers often use gender-type strategies to advertise their products. For example, commercial or packaging for sports equipment, race car sets, or action-oriented video games featuring boys, and those for dolls picture for girls. And next time you're watching television, watch very careful at the advertisements during daytime television. Most either target boys or girls, but not necessarily one toy markets to both genders at the same time. And these type of marketing ploys influence children as well as their parents. And speaking of parents, parents also like to give their children the same kind of toys they played with as children. And unfortunately, sometimes this tends to perpetuate traditional gender stereotyping. Just a couple years ago, actually this Christmas, I was walking through the Target aisles, and they had an end cap in the toy section, and they were all what's the word? Not antique, but toys that were very popular when I was a child. That a lot of them were given to me. So things like the play school pull behind telephone, where the eyes shook as the wheels turned, and it was one of those old school toys that had kind of been reintroduced onto the market shelves recently, and it kind of creates this sense of nostalgia when parents see toys like Lincoln Logs or like Tinker Toys that have been brought back. Parents get excited about the nostalgia, and they want to end up giving that to their children. And unfortunately, sometimes this kind of helps promote gender typing by negatively reinforcing the play with toys that they judge to be gender appropriate. For example, maybe telling boys not to play with dolls. In a study of gender typing toys and preschoolers, Ragg and Ratcliffe in 1998 found that many of the boys thought their fathers would perceive cross-gender typing toys as bad. They also found that children who had a parent or significant other who viewed gender-neutral toys as bad were somewhat influenced by gender-typed toy labels. Such gender typing through toys is very slow to change. However, there is little evidence of change over the past several decades. In a unique study in 1999, Pinnell, disguised as a Santa's head elf, questioned 359 males and 417 females of various ages, various ethnic backgrounds about their toy preferences. And Pinnell found that both girls, and to an even greater extent boys, had very strong gender-type toy preferences. In recent years, society has become more aware of the many ways in which children are gender-typed and the implications of this process. Yet there's very little evidence of any substantial change away from gender typing. So it's important that teachers realize that they influence sometimes the aspect of this aspect of socialization because of the evidence that shows that teachers still behave differently toward the play of boys than toward that of the girls. Teachers are able to reinforce early gender typing by continuing to label certain activities as more important or appropriate for one sex over the other. They can choose different activities for boys' and girls' achievements, or they can make every attempt possible to eliminate such distinctions and allow each individual really to kind of explore his or her full potential. It is likely that as such day-to-day decisions and expectations accumulate over time, it's possible to reduce differences in boys' and girls' motor development by kind of channeling their practice opportunities. And then the chapter ends with other sociocultural constraints regarding race, ethnicity, as well as socioeconomic status. And it's all too often very difficult to distinguish between sociocultural constraints of the group and then the individual constraints of one particular person. Um, Earlier in the chapter, we describe some constraints related to gender as socially constructed rather than biologically defined. For example, the notion that girls are weaker than boys is firmly established in the Western culture, even though there's very little biological evidence that backs it up. Remember that even very few physiological differences exist between boys and girls before puberty. That's why you can see a fourth or a fifth grade girl and a boy, come in almost tied for a mile run or push-ups or sit-ups in their PE, testing days. Socially constructed notions also go beyond gender differences when we talk about race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. Sometimes it's very difficult to distinguish between the constraints and individual constraints, like we said earlier, mostly because research may not be completely clear-cut on how race, class, or even ethnicity is even defined. For example, race and ethnicity are often used together, but they're not equivalent. Racial characteristics are biologically based and relate to genetic similarities within groups, whereas ethnic characteristics are culturally based and relate to cultural similarities that connect groups. Race and ethnicity can coincide, which then makes their independent study very, very difficult. Furthermore, then, social class and socioeconomic status are associated with certain characteristics that may cut across race and ethnicity. And given that all of these factors interrelate, it's very difficult to identify constraints as either strictly sociocultural or individual, especially when considering socioeconomic status. And so therefore, it might be best to consider the relationship of SES to other factors when looking for the influence of constraints. For example, children who come from a lower socioeconomic status background may have less access to organized sports and physical activities, particularly those that require expensive equipment or lessons, as well as maybe extensive time commitments from at least one parent. And as a result, these children may not gain experiences of practice related to these particular activities. So we should consider that research on race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status from a slightly different point of view, maybe one that examines differences among groups without suggesting a priori that differences are biological in nature. This approach would allow us to examine the potential influence of a variety of constraints without limiting our interpretation to biological facts, which might actually be a cultural assumption. And then we have researchers in 2004, Melina Bouchard and Bar Orr, said that they give an extensive review of historical and contemporary research related to physical differences based on race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. If you have time, get on Google Scholar, punch in their names and the year of the research. You'll find some really interesting papers that come up. So to summarize Chapter 12, we talked about how humans are social beings, that individuals constantly interact with and depend on others as a part of everyday life, and that people can form groups that can be small, medium, or large, and these groups often feature distinct values that create a social atmosphere in which group members live. So groups and group members act as socializing agents who, along with social situations, encourage what is viewed as social and culturally appropriate motor development. And these sociocultural constraints interact again with the functional individual constraints to influence motivation, self-esteem, even feelings of competence for a task. And so what we'll talk about next in Chapter 13 are constraint interactions that occur for physical activity.